Welcome to Groam House Museum's podcast, At Home with the Picts, a crafted legacy. I am your host, storyteller Eileen Budd, and throughout this podcast I will be taking you on a journey with me around Scotland and beyond, exploring Groam House Museum's collection, speaking to contemporary craftspeople, artists and musicians whose work uses the same or similar techniques to the Picts. In this podcast, we will meet stone carvers, weavers, and carnix players. We will speak to academics, archaeologists, and blacksmiths, and together explore how the Picts lived and how they made their art. Because, as George Bain once said, theory may inform, but practice convinces. Groam House Museum houses a wonderful collection of Pictish art, which is central to this podcast, including a beautiful collection of penannular brooches, this beautiful screen, which we'll hear more about later, and the Rosemarkie stone, which is a 2.6 metre high Pictish cross slab believed to have once stood at the entrance of a monastic enclosure during the 8th century. Groam House is also home to the George Bain collection. George Bain was a Scottish illustrator, watercolourist, designer and art teacher who believed in keeping Celtic art as a living creative art form. And it's his philosophy of learning from doing that this podcast is inspired by. Held by Groam House, the George Bain collection is a recognised collection of national significance to Scotland. When I visited Groam House, I got to have a wee look at his work and spoke to staff and volunteers there to hear more about their collections and current theories on the Picts. In this episode, staff and volunteers at Groam House Museum will be talking to us about their collection of Pictish stones and artefacts. We'll explore various theories around the origins and disappearance of the Picts, discovering and dispelling some of the myths along the way. Let's begin with a couple of glimpses into who the Picts were according to early Irish sources. Early writers speak of a race called the Cruinne, kings of Alapa and Ireland, who fought the Britons, and they had 6 demonic druids who listened for the voices of birds and heard music and melodies of all kinds. They taught the people about mounds and standing stones, and they looked for portents of future fortunes in sneezing and the elements. They're said to have made their home in Alapa with the swiftness of the falcon. One of these druids, Drostan, also had a cure for the Britons' poison blades. Before battle, he ordered 150 cows to be milked in the battlefield, and for the milk to pool. Any of the Cruinne cut by a Briton's blade was to lie in the milk and be cured. And that, they say, is how they won the battle and expelled the Britons. In the Ulster cycle, the legend Tocha Bruchne da Jerga describes 3 Pictish warriors as seen in a tavern. It goes like this. I saw another booth there, with 3 men in it, 3 tall swarthy men, 3 round heads of dark hair on them, equally long at the neck and on the forehead, 3 short black cloaks around them, reaching to the elbows, 3 cloaks with long hoods, 3 huge black swords they had, and they carried 3 black shields, with 3 broad dark green spears. The shaft of each spear was as thick as the spit of a cauldron. Do you know men like them, Fair Rogan? I can't think of men like them. I do not know 3 men like that in Ireland, unless it is that trio there from Pictland who went into exile out of their country and are now in Conair's household. These are their names: Dulonga, son of Trebuat, and Trebuat, son of Hualonsk, and Cernach, son of Huafech. Those are the 3 best men in Pictland for taking arms. 90 will fall at their hands in their first encounter. These written sources give an impression of a strong people with a sophisticated belief system in hierarchical society. But as there are no yet known sources written by the Picts themselves, what can we glean from what they left behind?
I'm Alistair Morton. I've been with the museum for about 17 years. I've been a director when we had directors. I'm a trustee at the moment, but I've also been a volunteer all that time. So I've been opening the museum to visitors and helping with, well, all sorts of things really. But I'm not a museum qualified person, so I'm just an interested amateur.
What interests you most about the Picts? What is it that you find so compelling?
It's the amount that we don't know about them, in a sense. I did an archaeology degree at university specialising in the Romans, and there's very little that we don't know about the Romans, so there's no mystery. But with the Picts it's very different, and I was drawn into it really from the point of view of George Bain and Pictish art. So as a teenager I tried my hand at following Bain's teachings on how to create Celtic art. He was most interested in Pictish art, and that drew me in. So then I dragged my parents to see various Pictish stones, and it kind of went on from there.
You were saying that you've studied the Romans. The joy of the Romans is that there was so much that they wrote down.
Absolutely, that's right, yes. And inscriptions were one of the things that I specialised in. And what a contrast with the Picts, who, as far as we can tell, only used the Pictish language as a spoken language. There's no real evidence for them having ever written anything down in Pictish. We have some what appear to be Pictish names in inscriptions written in Ogham, the Irish-based alphabet system, but that's about it really.
Do you think there's any chance of us ever finding, a kind of Rosetta Stone of Pictish?
It's a really good question. I don't think there is any chance, no. And for it to work, it would have to have some form of Pictish script, which, as far as we can tell, doesn't exist, alongside some Latin. That's the only thing that would kind of work. But I don't see it happening now. No.
It's one of those things that it's something that we struggle with now, is the difference between like our oral tradition and oral history, and then what's written down in written history.
Yes. I mean, presumably it was an oral culture, yes. I think the Vikings were operated in quite a similar way, so you would have had people who knew the tales and could recite them, and probably different people who knew the laws and could recite them to order when necessary. That's what we have to assume, I think, in the absence of any evidence.
How much can we learn about the Picts from the sculptured stones and the artistry that they left?
We can learn about their abilities in stone carving, which were pretty awesome, and their interest in animals and birds. But also, here and there, you get other things. So there's on the stone at Kirriemuir, for example, there's actually a carving of a loom,
Yes.
with a woman, a Pictish woman beside it. I think I'm right in saying. I also think I'm right in saying one of only two Pictish women in Pictish sculpture. Representations of harps are very useful in terms of what they were up to musically, and you get some indication of social hierarchy as well, in the scenes with figures. There's some are bigger than others, and they're obviously the more important people. And hunting scenes are very common on the cross slabs. Gives us some insight into what they got up to in that area. So yeah, we can learn quite a lot, but nowhere near as much as through archaeology. We can learn to get an awful lot of information from stuff in the earth. There's not been much concentration of excavation on Pictish sites until quite recently. Gordon Noble at Aberdeen University is making a huge difference there. So he's actually carrying out research archaeology has been a fairly rare thing. Most archaeology is what I think of as rescue archaeology, where people are investigating sites ahead of development before the evidence is destroyed.
What do we know, the kind of life that they were living? What can we assume about how they were living?
I think it must have been a very simple life. We haven't found many Pictish dwellings, but the ones that we have found are more or less rectangular buildings, and they look as though the Picts, the humans, lived in one end, and probably their cattle lived in the other end. This is just the same as how things were around the time of Culloden.
Yes.
Nothing much changed right the way through. So it must have been pretty simple, but then sometimes things got exciting, and every man presumably had his weapons, and if need be they could raise an army to do something. So it was an agricultural based warrior society, really.
There must have been quite a division between day-to-day life and then being ready to defend.
Absolutely.
If you could speak to a Pict, imagining that you could speak his language, what would you ask him if you had one question?
Oh, crikey, that's a really good one, isn't it? Yeah. Well, I suppose the thing I would like to understand first of all would be the organisational structure. Who's in charge here? What's their relationship with the king, if there is one? Is there a king? How does all that work?
So folklorists have dated a lot of our stories, a lot of our myths, all the way back to Iron Age and Bronze Age, which is amazing. What kind of stories do you think the Picts might be telling one another?
Well, I don't know. Presumably, they will have had some sort of creation myth. Where did they think they'd come from? I can't remember now where it appears, but there's this idea that there was an original 7 tribes. I don't know, seven kingdoms. So they will have had some
kind of
story about where they originated, presumably.
There's the story of the Cruinia.
That's the one.
Yes. The story of the Cruinia, people coming over and settling, and it's quite an interesting myth. And it's quite similar to the Irish Tuatha De Danann as well. It's that kind of origin myth. That one, the Cruinia one, was recorded in Fordun's Chronicle.
Ah, right, okay.
I think, and also the Scotonachron. But that's another issue, isn't it? Because although the written record is very helpful for people studying history and archaeology, it can also be full of red herrings. For example, with the Romans, we know a lot of that was kind of propaganda for back home. And their descriptions of the Picts are quite interesting, also quite dubious. And it's the same with the medieval scribes, some of them, they were copying story after story and sometimes just added things.
Yes, or made mistakes in copying. Yes, trying to work out the validity of some of these things. Yeah, very difficult. Yeah, it's all very infuriating, isn't it? Because early medieval monastic tradition elsewhere involved, in the Anglo-Saxon world, in the Irish world, people in the monasteries were writing these annals about what happened every year. And they're incredibly useful for Pictish history because sometimes they refer to things that were happening in Pictland. So you have to assume, I think, that once you had monasteries in Pictland and monks who read and wrote Latin, that the similar annals would have been being written in Pictish monasteries, but we don't have them. So the Picts' version of events
is absent.
All we know is what other people thought was going on and what they thought about it. Which is kind of infuriating. And I blame the Vikings.
Yeah.
Because I reckon these things must have existed, and I think they disappeared as a result of the Viking raids.
Yeah.
in the 9th century.
The sacking and
Mm.
yeah. In your experience of working with Pictish history and this museum, what has been the thing that surprised you most?
And yes, I read this question and I didn't come up with any very good answer. I suppose the thing is, I'm not sure it's surprised is quite the right thing, but you know, it's fascinating just how interested people can be in this, you know. You get so many visitors who are, you know, really enthralled by the whole subject. A lot of it is to do with the unanswered questions. Because I always say to visitors, you know, if we did find that Rosetta Stone, our visitor numbers would drop,
Really?
I reckon, because, you know, some of the mystery would have gone, and the symbols are kind of the most attractive aspect of the Picts, I think. It's the one that really grabs people, is what do these things mean? And if we knew what they meant, you know, half the mystery would be gone, and I think that would.
What do you want people to know?
Yeah, about them. I think the thing is, you want people to appreciate just how sophisticated they could be, and the sculpture is the best way to show that. I mean, our cross slab is an amazing piece of work, and okay, you know, the ordinary Pict was not like the sort of person who could design or create the thing, but he probably understood what it was telling him, which is quite remarkable. We did quite a lot of work with a really interesting artist called Thomas Keyes, who's self-taught himself how to create a Celtic manuscript from scratch. So he makes his own parchment, his own pigments, and being an artist, he can actually do the thing. And he's very knowledgeable about sacred geometry, so he's kind of worked out how the design of the cross slab was conceived and what it's based on in geometric terms, and kind of what the symbolism. He has this idea that the Picts looked at things with a sort of geometrical head on them that we don't have today. How far down the social hierarchy that would have extended, who knows, but it's very interesting.
I'm Doug McLean, and I've been with Groam House for 10 years now. I joined the museum as a trustee, or as a director as it was in those days. We became trustees later. And I guess my interest was just in how I could contribute to the development of the museum and see it grow over time. When I first joined, the Picts were a mysterious people about which we knew very little. That was the stock phrase. But now it seems we actually know quite a lot about them in terms of, you know, where they lived, how they lived. You know, you visit Birkhead, for example, and you begin to get a feel for, yes, you're in some place that historically they lived, and you're somehow picking up the vibrations from them. And you look at the Rosemarkie stone and you think this is something passed down through the centuries that gives you a message, you're just not sure what it is.
It is incredible that it's the artistry that has survived best with the, you know, when it comes to Pictish collections, you know, with the sculptured stones.
Well, stones are fairly long lasting, that's the great thing about them. The likes of the Rosemarkie stone, it's just the craftsmanship. It's not something that's been cobbled together in a rush. It's something that's been meticulously planned and executed to a remarkable degree, and it's that stands out when you look at it, and indeed other stones like the big stone. It's just exquisite.
Such a specialist job.
Well, with some of them you wonder how they managed to carve the stone without actually breaking it. You know, I know there are theories on how they might have done it. I mean, particularly the Rosemarkie stone, because it's quite long and thin, and you imagine that if it was carved anywhere other than on site, it would be very fragile in trying to place it where it was finally located, which I think we think was down by the shore, to mark the position of the monastery for pilgrims.
Very interesting. When we are looking at sculptured stones, is there something that we should focus in on when we're looking at them to try and understand the Picts better?
Well, I must admit, when I'm taking people around the museum, it's the sheer quality of the carving, and it's the geometric nature of it, and carving things that are very intricate and very easy to get wrong, particularly all the interlace. In other parts of the museum, where you look at the key pattern, for example, the key pattern slabs, you can, if you look carefully, there's mistakes. You can spot them, and it's interesting just to show people where these mistakes are. And there's a grave slab with spirals on it, where one of the spirals just doesn't look right, because both spirals on opposite sides of the design are identical, and really they shouldn't be. One of them should be a reverse image, and because it's not a reverse image, it doesn't quite fit in with the rest of the design, so they've had to make a bit of a dog leg to make it fit. And you think, I wonder how that happened, and you think, I bet somebody drew that on a piece of parchment or something and gave it to the sculptor to say, here, that's what goes there. And he was supposed to turn it over for the other side, and he forgot. And you think, what's that, no evidence for that whatsoever. But you think, that's the kind of a human thing, which brings it to life, to think, maybe he made a mistake.
Yeah.
And because that, I suppose, that's the attraction of the stones, that somebody made them, and somebody either did a fantastic job of getting it spot on, or occasionally you can see, they made a mistake there, which just makes it so much more human.
And the fact that they kept it and didn't smash it and start all over again.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I suppose if you put that much effort into it, you probably just leave it as it is. The mistakes in the key pattern are not that obvious until you look closely. So if you look at a distance, it looks fine.
They're just showing it from far away. Have you learned anything about the Pictish belief systems, like spiritual systems?
I often wonder, they talk about the conversion of the Picts to Christianity post St. Columba coming over, apparently, and you think it's always kind of presented, it just happened like that, the Picts converted to Christianity, and from there on Christian crosses appeared on their stones and so on. And you think, well, how did that happen? How long did it take? You're thinking maybe 100 years? Did it take 100 years for it to kind of filter down through society? Clearly the Rosemarkie site was a Christian settlement. What it was before that, I've no idea. Whether it existed as a Pictish settlement. But clearly it's driven by Christian doctrine and principles. I think the church was the Church of St. Peter, it was originally called, here in Rosemarkie, I seem to remember from somewhere.
Yeah, I can't imagine that it would have just been Columba showing up saying, "You'll love this guy." I think he would have had to have gotten to know what the belief systems were in place, and we know that there are later medieval churches and ecclesiastical art that there were more heathen or pagan things incorporated into it, and that makes sense. like going to a people and go, oh, you like the Green Man? Oh, we've got him.
Yeah.
Yeah, you like the Mother Goddess?
Mhm.
Oh, you're gonna love Mary.
Mhm. Mhm.
It makes sense to me that they would be incorporation of beliefs.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
yeah, over a period of time.
I mean, the Rosemarkie stone would appear to be very clearly a marker to do with the monastery. So it's something like just a marker for pilgrims who are coming to the area to say, here it is, you've found the monastery. But other stones elsewhere are perhaps celebrating other things and quite unrelated to religion or the church, like battle scenes, hunting scenes. Some, I take it, are kind of representing historic events. Some are more like place markers.
And there is so much that we don't know about the Picts, but that leaves us with a huge amount to think about or to
Yeah,
imagine.
yes, and especially when you start to look at their abstract depictions on the stones, like the crescent and V rod. What does that mean? Some people suggest it's the path of the sun between the summer solstice and the winter solstice, the two. In fact, one of the local artists here did some measurements and suggested that the Rosemarkie stone crescent shape actually does very accurately map out the path of the sun between summer and winter. It's an interesting thought. Maybe it is something astronomical, I don't know.
Well, if it's charting the sun throughout those seasons, it could potentially be related to like an almanac
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
for growing crops, or
yeah,
for
yeah. It's the V rod that puzzles me as to what that's got to do with it, but there you go.
what does that represent?
Mm-hmm.
What would you like people to know about the Picts?
What I would most like to do is to see more of the gaps being filled, so that some of the questions that people have about how did they live, how did they dress, what did they eat, all of these questions which we know little bits about, so just bringing them to life as to, how would you know a Pict if you met one in the streets?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
From Groam House Museum, I then went to Aberdeen University to interview Professor Gordon Noble, because he is at the forefront of the latest Pictish archaeological finds and research, and it was a fascinating discussion.
Gordon Noble, I'm Professor of Archaeology at the University of Aberdeen.
And you're also at the forefront of all the most recent research about the Picts.
Yeah, we've been working on quite a few different sites recently. There's been East Lomond down in Fife, which is a major Pictish hill fort dating from the 3rd to the 7th century AD. We're finding all sorts of everyday objects of the Picts, things like weaponry or pottery or gaming pieces. And the fact that we're finding that at all is quite remarkable, because we have so few settlements from the Pictish period. So it's really, really exciting when you begin to find buildings and floor layers and hearths that Picts sat next to and played their games or ate their food and the like. We're also working on Burgh Head, which is up in the Murray coastline, another Pictish fort, this time a coastal one. And because of the preservation conditions there, we've got almost a metre of sand overlying the Pictish levels. We have really ephemeral traces of Pictish buildings, and again, amazing insights into everyday life of the Picts. So we've got things like jewellery, rings, brooches, and really well preserved bone pins and combs that they were using to comb their hair with. So that's quite remarkable as well.
because quite often the bone isn't preserved, is it, because of a lot of the soil?
Yeah, soil in Scotland's very acidic in general, certainly in northeast Scotland, where we tend to have most of the Pictish sites. So where you do get a site like Burghead, where you are getting bone preservation, that's amazing, because you do find objects that you don't normally see in the archaeological records. So we see things like combs on the Pictish stones, but to actually find the objects themselves is really, really exciting.
Yeah, I bet, because you can kind of match up the object to the picture.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
I think the Picts are probably best known for their sculptured stones, aren't they?
Yeah, and it's an amazing legacy they've left behind. What do these symbols mean on these stones? Can we crack the code? So it's like a real mystery that people want to get their teeth into. It's an enduring mystery in some ways, but we are getting closer, I think, to understanding them. So the most likely interpretation is some sort of identity marker. So on some of the later stones you see individuals and they're marked by the symbols. So it must be referring to their name or their rank or their identity of some kind. And names seem most likely, because this is what most systems of inscription across northwest Europe in this time period are generally about names and naming individuals. But we don't know for sure if that's the case or not. So it's still exciting to think about what they might mean and how we might find out more, basically.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And some of them, they have more ecclesiastical symbols on them. Yeah, it's more, some things I suppose are more easier to piece together.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, they must have been in operation for at least 500 to 700 years. So, it's a long time for them to evolve, and society was hugely changing in that time period, going from a largely pagan society to an early Christian one. And yet those symbols endure, and they're deployed on Christian monuments as well as what are likely to be pre-Christian monuments. So that's really interesting to try and trace their development through time, and clearly suggests that people were attached to this style of communication. We're puzzled by it today, but clearly meant something that had this enduring significance and quality in the Pictish period. It's fascinating to try and find out more about these people and understand their society and their world. And it was clearly a complex world with craftspeople working on amazing monuments and artifacts from this time period. It's not just the sculpture, there's amazing metalwork that they're creating illuminated manuscripts perhaps as well, suggested by the evidence from Port Mahomet. So there's a whole range of different classes of people and roles within society. Farming would have been the basis of society, but we know that this is becoming an increasingly complex and hierarchical society. We know from the limited historical sources that we have that there were kings of the Picts, and a nobility. So we have various references. In fact, the only real documents we have from the Picts is the list of kings, and that goes back into the Roman period and even earlier, and was clearly something that people thought important to mark. There's probably different ranks of king as well. There are sub-kings mentioned in some of our sources. And it is the first documented kingdoms we have from this part of the world. I mean, there could have been earlier forms of kings that are not documented, but certainly our Roman sources don't mention kings. It seems to be something that's happening in either a late Roman period or immediate post-Roman. So that's an obvious change within society. And again, it seems like a very, very ranked society is beginning to develop in these northern frontier locations.
It makes sense to me that there would be lesser kings or sub-kings because of the huge swathe of land that the Picts had a hold of with the kingdom of Fortiu. So the idea of having people in all these different areas, but with a quite consistent idea about symbolism in the stones, is quite fascinating to kind of get a grip of that, especially when we think of Scotland today, where we've got so many different cultural differences in between different areas.
So yeah, it's quite fascinating that that is actually held together for.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's quite unusual in this time period to have such an extensive kingdom. So in contemporary Ireland, for example, we've got hundreds of different petty kingdoms operating in the same time period, and it could be that's the same in Pictland, and we just don't have the evidence. But it does seem like they had a more extensive extent to power and authority of much smaller numbers of kings or elites within this time period. And it could be that these kingdoms are perhaps longer in duration than we think, with the real foundations of them happening in that kind of late Roman period. And that forms the foundations for these quite extensive geographical extent of the Pictish kingdoms, which stretched all the way from Fife up to the Northern Isles, we think, and across to the Western Isles. So huge chunk of what became Scotland was ruled or at least influenced by these Pictish elites and society. A lot of the kind of analytical work recently has shown that a lot of the silver, for example, which they're using to make these amazing brooches and pins and the like, is actually Roman silver. And so they're getting that through bribes or gifts coming from the Roman Empire, or through raiding the Roman Empire, or even serving within the army in some cases. And so that material's filtering into local society, and they're reworking that metal resource to make objects that are more appropriate for local lifestyles and to express power and identity. So it's fascinating how they're reworking that material through time. So there's some remarkable objects. If you've seen some of the Pictish silver chains that have been identified, or silver chains with Pictish symbols on them, hand pins that people are using for fastening their cloaks and hair, and then probably the real symbol of status in the Pictish period was these huge penannular brooches you get, which again are for fastening your cloak. And we see production evidence for that at places like Rhynie or Dundurn, all the kind of major centres. So it seems to be a real indication of status, and you see that on some of the symbol stones as well. They have things like anvils or tongs for metalworking depicted on the stones, because this was a non-coin using economy, so this would be the real symbol of wealth and the real reality of exchange and economy in this time period. And one of the amazing things about the archaeological sites we're digging is that we don't often find the objects themselves, but we find the production evidence. So we find moulds for making objects. And one of the most amazing things we found in recent year was at Rhynie in Aberdeenshire, which seems to be in this early royal centre of the Picts. And we're finding moulds for making objects which resemble what you see on the stones again. So it's amazing you're able to begin to tie down the chronology and the significance of the stones by finding objects in the ground that you can relate to that. So we're finding things like at Rhynie they were making little animal figurines of hounds or wolves or wild boar, which is the animals you see on the symbols. So that's just really, really amazing to find things in the ground that relate to what you see on their amazing artwork.
Absolutely. One of the theories about the Picts is that they were very much kind of like an oral society, and this, I believe, is mostly based on the fact that we don't have written records, which makes this, the problem of the Picts, the fact that we don't have these written resources, except for the ones done by Irish or Romans.
Yep.
In your experience of archaeological digs and researching, have you found synergies between any of these written records and what you're finding?
Yeah, I mean, they're broadly reflecting actual events within societies. So one of the amazing things about the Irish annals, for example, is it records things like the attacking and besieging of forts. And that got a real preponderance of those references in relation to Pictland and Scotland in general compared to Ireland. And that's absolutely the case. One of the dominating aspects of our archaeology are these fortified settlements, hilltop or promontory forts. And when we excavate them, what do we find? A lot of them have been burnt down. Either the ramparts have been destroyed by fire, etc. So it's not, these Irish Channel accounts are reflecting real events, and clearly pivotal events within society. If these are elite centres, you can imagine the destruction of a particular king's power base must have had real shockwaves within society. A kind of revolutionary element to it. So they're undoubtedly telling us real events about Pictish life and Pictish society and what was important to the people who were writing down these sources. But I think it's very likely that the Picts were writing books as well. So we've got this amazing evidence from Port Mahomet, so not too far from Groam House up on the Tarbert Peninsula, which is another monastic settlement. And they found evidence for the production of vellum for making books. So they must have been making either religious books or books of multi-purposes perhaps. And so that was again a real eye-opener in terms of what we can find through the archaeological record, but also we are missing all these written sources. Demise of the Pictish language certainly didn't help in terms of some of the power centres, libraries, etc., the significance of particular monastic houses would have been diminished by that. So yeah, for whatever reason, we probably are missing a lot of written sources that Picts had. But you never know. We might find one thrown in a bog somewhere and we can still reconstruct that. But I think for me, the amazing thing, I would say that's some bias as an archaeologist, is that we can find out so much from the archaeological record. And people have been a bit wary of that in terms of there was this perception that there's not that many sites out there. And it's still quite hard to find Pictish sites, but when we do, we can find remarkable things that tell us a lot about Pictish life.
One of the sites that you were exploring had something like 800 houses on it,
Yeah,
is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so that's Tappa North, which is this huge hill fort that overlooks Rhynie in Aberdeenshire. And this seems to be an early royal centre, so the place name means a place associated with a great king or a sacred king. And that seems to have been down the lowlands where we found this amazing complex where we had timber buildings that had wine amphora coming from the eastern Mediterranean, glass coming from western France, the kind of stuff you find on royal sites elsewhere. So these Pictish elites were drinking Mediterranean wine out of their French wine glasses, which is amazing to think about. So we thought we found this amazing site, which we had. But then we didn't realise that it was just the kind of tip of the iceberg in terms of Tappa North is thought to have been, or long thought to have been, prehistoric Iron Age and or late Bronze Age, and elements of it are in terms of there's an Iron Age fort right on top, but enclosed. The lower slopes enclosed by this huge rampart, which is like 1.5 kilometres in circumference, and it encloses all these house platforms, about 800. And we dated, we dated about 20 of them, still a small sample, but they're all kind of 3rd century through to 7th century, so right in the kind of period in which the Picts are first mentioned through to the documented Pictish over kingdom in the 7th century. So it's amazing, you think about, we had probably literally a handful of Pictish houses down the lowlands to one site that's now got 800. Or we presume it's got 800. It'll be a long time before we excavate all this. But yeah, it's amazing. It shows you how, again, our information can go through this huge transformation in terms of, 1 minute we've got no settlement evidence to next minute think of the implications of that. What is this site? It must be a huge population centre, whether that's seasonal or, a permanent centre of settlement. So yeah, it's really exciting, but it makes us completely rethink Pictish society in terms of the scale of some of these sites and the resources that they were able to draw upon at these major centres. We can have big transformations in our historical knowledge as well, but I think that was the moment for me when I kind of moved from things like history of art, into archaeology. It was like, wow, this is amazing, because you can produce your own data sets, your own knowledge about the past, and that can be quite dramatic leaps forward. And so yeah, that's exciting that when we have those big revelations. And the Tappa North dating was it was just incredible. And we weren't really quite ready conceptually for the dates to come back and be like, oh my god, they're slap bang in the Pictish period rather than being, prehistoric or something else. So yeah, it's really exciting when that happens, for sure. I mean, it still amazes me, even as an archaeologist, you're walking over, these humps and bumps in the landscape, and you stick your spade in, and there's some, Pictish house with some of the objects still in it from, 1500 years ago. That's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, that's incredible.
So it doesn't cease to amaze me what we can find and what we can find out from that. And sometimes it's the big discoveries like that, but sometimes it's the real, kind of micro work where you have, for example, we on the Tapanoff site, we had lots of handmade pottery, which turned out to be Pictish pottery, which, in ourselves, we didn't really know they were making their own pottery in that time period. And we had a Canadian researcher called Shailin Prado, who was looking at the kind of tiny plant remains, phytoliths you get preserved in things like pottery, and finding things like barley grains. They were making a kind of porridge in these pots. And again, it's just that little information that just really enriches our view of the Picts and really brings it home, how these people were living and the things they were eating in everyday life. And although they have things like, wild animals shown on their stones, that every reality was them eating their porridge around the fire. It wasn't them off, hunting stags or boar. Occasionally they did that, but the everyday life was literally at the grindstone grinding your grain to make your porridge every day.
That's amazing about pottery, because I know that generally speaking, the belief is that they had that there was no remains of it.
Yeah,
Was it?
yeah.
So that's amazing.
It is amazing, yeah, and that's just like, we've got all these big discoveries, but sometimes it's just things like that. It just makes you stop and think. It's like, wow, that's how little we knew, that we didn't even know that they made their own pots.
Do we know what the pots looked like at all?
Well, it's probably partly the reason we haven't identified them. They look very similar to what they were making in the Iron Age. Fairly simple coil-built vessels, a range of kind of serving and storage vessels, plainly decorated as far as we can see. But yeah, it's amazing that we now can say that. The Picts had pots, and this is what they were making in them. So they're storing barley, they're cooking barley. Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So they would look maybe similar to beaker folk vessels, maybe?
Yeah, but undecorated, so there's no decorations, the ones we found, but yeah, who knows what we might find yet.
The architecture of the Picts as well is a bit different from what comes before. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I find this fascinating, because it's also similar to some of the kind of houses that were built, again, 18th, 19th century in Scotland. Could you talk to us a little bit about Pictish architecture?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a difficult topic because it's slightly the kind of archaeology of absence, in terms of they're not that visible in the landscape today. And that's one of the reasons why it's been so hard to find the Pictish sites. But they're also using materials that were quite ephemeral. They're probably very robust in their day, but they just don't survive very well. So they're clearly using things like turf for walls of their buildings, really super, green, eco-insulating properties that we would welcome today, but they don't survive very well. So it's only at sites like Burghead where you don't have that later ploughing or agricultural destruction, and you've got this overburden that preserves them, that we can get kind of faint traces of where the walls will. Otherwise, often all you get, if there is any preservation, is just the hearths and maybe a floor layer kind of extending beyond that, and it's very hard to know where the walls were. And they were clearly using things like crux frames and the like, so we have very little way of post holes. So that's a big change from what they were using in the Iron Age, where they were building these really large roundhouse buildings with lots of postal foundations, and we've got hundreds, if not thousands of those in the archaeological record. And then you come to about the 3rd century when the Picts are first mentioned, and there's this big architectural switch to these kind of non-earth-fast turf-based buildings, And traditionally we were like, oh my god, where's everyone gone? Because we couldn't find these buildings. And we'll probably never be able to find them in the kind of agricultural lowlands, because they just will have been ploughed away. So it is sites like Taffa North or promontory forts or hill forts where people haven't gone and, you know, cultivated later on, that we get the preservation of them. But the other interesting thing is the kind of shift to rectangular forms of building, and that's happening as early as the 3rd century again. So clearly different ways of conceptualizing space and building the structures are coming in that late Roman period, and it's something, as you say, pretty much endures until the 19th century. They're still building turf-built longhouses into the 19th. So yeah, it's a very enduring tradition of architecture. It's quite frustrating though, because you know there's only certain conditions you can find this.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I know there's some croft houses, some of the villages that are kind of missing, especially in the Angus Glens.
Yeah.
We know they used to be there, they're on the map. The name is on the map anyway. But so little of them remains because they were built with river stones, clay, watland daub, which just, if you're not maintaining it.
No, exactly. No, very robust, you know, very substantial when you are maintaining them and living in them, but as soon as you abandon these sites, the turf decays, it blows away, it dissolves. Yeah, and that makes a real difficulty to find the settlements.
You mentioned that the Picts are only really mentioned in historical records around about the 3rd century. The question, I suppose, would be, well, where were they before then? Did they come in? Are they just a power tribe of that time?
Yeah.
Where did they come from?
Yeah, so it seems to be, it's a Roman coining, so it means the painted people or the tattooed people. You know, it's barbarians essentially. So it is a likely to be a Roman coining, a Roman name for these groups who lived north of the frontier. These barbarians who were non-Roman and causing all sorts of havoc north of the frontier. But that name does seem to have stuck. You know, we got this reference to the Pictish kings, Pictish identities right through to the 9th, early 10th century. So certainly the neighbours of these people adopted that term, and probably the Picts themselves. But yeah, where does it come from? Well, I think it's just, you know, is this Roman coining reflecting the groups who are already there? But it does seem to imply some sort of coalescing of some of these smaller groups that are there in the early Roman periods. In the early Roman period we have things like Ptolemy's map, which plots out all these different tribal groups, for want of a better term, who seem to be relatively small scale, but the Pictish identity seems to be one that is about the coalescing of some of these smaller groups to create these bigger polities. And that's something we find across the Roman Empire. You know, if you've got an empire on your doorstep, how do you resist if you want to resist? And one way is to coalesce all these smaller groups into something that can, you know, fight off this attempts at domination or destruction even. The Roman sources themselves imply that the groups north of the frontier in what is now Scotland were coming together and creating these larger confederacies, or whatever you want to call them. So it seems to be an outcome of having this, you know, Mediterranean civilization on your doorstep, that these groups came together. And that kind of, I think that sets the foundations for the formation of these kingdoms and these more hierarchical polities that emerged in the post-Roman period. You know, the Picts would never have emerged if it hadn't been for that Roman influence, or not in the form that they took, perhaps.
And it must have been quite influential for, like, the Picts and the other people who were coming together with the Picts to become the Picts, because the Roman army was not just made up of Mediterranean people. It was people all over the Roman Empire, whoever they had dominated, they had captured and enlisted, volunteered. So the Picts would have been seeing a great range of different people. And I wonder if that was partly influential in their decision
to also band together as lots of different people.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we shouldn't, pin all developments at the doorstep of the Romans, but it would have been a huge influence in terms of, even things like developing a written symbol system. It's got to be influenced by writing. Mediterranean styles of communication, military tactics, I'm sure would have developed because of awareness of the Roman army, and architectural changes possibly as well. I mean, why did they suddenly shift to rectangular buildings? I mean, the obvious influence is Roman architecture. I mean, people in lowland Scotland hadn't been building rectangular structures for, 3,000, 4,000 years. So, there's got to be an influence there. But obviously the Picts were doing their own things as well. They didn't develop a written system that was built on the Latin alphabet, for example, as they did in Ireland and Scandinavia. They created a simple system which was completely their own. And maybe, things like that are deliberately anti-Roman. There's something different and marks that these people as being different to those civilizations in inverted comma, living south of the frontier.
And when I think of rectangles, rectangular buildings and Romans, the first thing I would think of would be like the testudo, the formation, one of their battle formations.
Yeah.
And their shields as well, which are
Absolutely.
much more kind of rectangular. So yeah, maybe that was a kind of influential. A new shape.
Yeah. Well, yeah, absolutely.
A defensive shape.
Yeah.
How much do you think their daily lives were spent as a percentage of making things, working the land, getting on with their lives, and defence?
That's a difficult one to say, but I think even the elites in society are fundamentally supported by agriculture. Even the elites are big land-owning, fancy farmers, essentially. So the vast majority of the population, their everyday lives would have been dictated by the agricultural cycle. There is some evidence for fishing, but it seems relatively minor within society. So agriculture is the real driver of the economy. And again, you've got kind of wild resources, but in terms of sort of material we find on sites, largely agriculture. It's grain, it's domesticated animals. So yeah, your whole routines of life would have been, looking after the fields, grinding your grain for your food every day, looking after animals, butchering animals for food. So these would have been the routines of life. And things like the kind of fancier metalworking and the like, as far as we can see, based on our evidence base so far, is that these are largely restricted to the elite centres. So again, it would have been a very small proportion of society who are engaging in things like, silver craft or bookmaking or whatever it is. So yeah, it's quite a restricted activity, these finer crafts, as far as we know. Although we still don't have a huge amount of the more kind of everyday settlements. So our record is slightly biased towards these elite centres, just because of the lack of survival of those everyday settlements. It's a growing picture, I guess, of what we know about everyday life.
When you're thinking about all these different people and they're living together and they're working together and they're trading in skills, but also for wine and silver, are you finding specific places of trade, like trysting places or evidence of markets?
Yes, although again our evidence might be biased, but again it's generally the hill forts and the major sites like that where we have evidence for trade. Occasionally you find them on other sites like Crannogs or unenclosed settlements, but they do seem to be concentrated at these, what we think of as the major elite centres. So places like Burgh Head, it's got these huge ramparts enclosing the settlement, but inside we've got evidence for these long distance connections to Anglo-Saxon England. We've got Northumbrian coins turning up in the 9th century. You've got coins from King Alfred turning up at Burgh Head. Going further back in time, you've got Rhynie with all these Mediterranean wine or oil amphora coming to the site, and other sites like Dundurn or King's Seat have got pottery coming from Western France that were holding dyes and foodstuffs and things. So these were well-connected people, at least at that elite level, and we can begin to reconstruct those networks through, excavating more sites and understanding the extent to which this material is circulating across society, or is it very concentrated? At the moment, it looks like it's very concentrated, so only available to a very small percentage of society. But at a wider level, they must have been trading things like foodstuffs and cattle and the like, again, at lower levels in society. Just the visibility of that's a bit less clear. But yeah, it's exciting to be able to reconstruct that networks and how people make contact with one another and create these networks of exchange and power at the elite level as well.
Yeah, I think again of like more as a modern comparison, the droving culture.
Yeah.
In fact, they were taking cattle. It's something that we kept doing.
Yeah.
And the evidence of that in the landscape. I wonder if we followed any of the old roads that they would have travelled.
Yeah, I mean, it's something, again, it's hard to identify, but at sites like Port Mahomet, the monastic centre there, they've got a roadway leading up to the church there. In Irish sources, they refer to road building and the like, so there must have been roads, and roads good enough for your chariots or your wagons to go over as well, and that's part of your dues to your king, is to help build roads and bridges and the like. So, yeah, again, it's a kind of fairly invisible aspect of the archaeological record. But at East Lomond, where we've been digging, there might be a part of a roadway in one of the trenches we've got. So yeah, they were clearly going to great lengths to allow people to connect across these long distances. And we also see that through the movement of people, so we can look at things like isotopes of individuals buried in graves. And basically you are what you eat or what you drink. So my colleague, for example, Kate Britton, has been looking at the isotopic signature of some of these Pictish burials, and you find that these individuals are moving from the west coast or the Northern Isles or elsewhere into Pictland. And so again, that kind of shakes up our understanding of Pictish inverted commas societies that would have been quite diverse in terms of people moving around, finding marriage partners, growing up in one part of what is now Scotland and dying in another location. They weren't static societies. So again, that's where archaeology helps enriching the picture of these groups.
Do we have evidence in the archaeological record of what they were wearing as well?
Yeah. Well, on the sculpture we do, for sure. Yeah. So we've got lots of evidence for clothing. They're wearing things like tunics and trousers. The religious figures, they tend to wear longer tunics. They've got long hair often when you see them on the stones, sometimes with these crazy moustaches. 19th handlebar moustaches on the 9th century monuments. They have these really prominent moustaches.
Vercingetorix.
Yeah. You see some of their weaponry. They have chariot or carriage, horse and carriage type vehicles you see on these stones. So the stones are amazing in terms of showing us aspects of Pictish life and identity. You see what look like women on horseback riding side saddle. But then in the archaeological record, occasionally you even get items of clothing. So there's an amazing woolen hood and jacket. It's in the National Museum. I don't know if you've seen that one. So occasionally you get bits of clothing surviving. So yeah, that's the kind of things we know about the Picts. We've got this amazing little object from Riney, which is this little copper alloy plaque. It's like the size of a 50p piece, and it looks like it's got a face incised on the plaque, and also it's presumably the face of a Pict, and it's got this amazing curly hair made by these kind of interlocking spirals. So it's amazing when you find objects like that show you faces of what are presumably Picts. at these sites.
What has been the thing that has surprised you most in your career of researching and digging up the Picts?
What surprised me most? Well, the discoveries that we made at Rhynie were really eye-opening, and I love to pretend that we had this grand scheme of we were going to find this amazing site and sites with Tapanoff and all that, but we had no idea. We had no idea. And, you know, within a couple of days of digging at the site, we began to find sherds of amphora from the Mediterranean, glass from Western France, and I was just like completely blown away by that. And it just made me and others realise that we could make big discoveries in Pictish archaeology, and that was just really the springboard for realising that we could do a lot more on this time period, and there's a lot more we can do.
I'm asking everybody, particularly the makers, what would you ask your contemporary? What would you ask a Pict, assuming you could go back in time for a day and you would understand each other?
Yeah. I don't know, we talk about this quite a lot, and I think increasingly the consensus is that we wouldn't want to go back in time, because then some of the mystery is gone. Not that we shouldn't continue to shroud the Picts in mystery, but there is so much we don't know. But I do wonder, like, if we actually knew what the symbols meant and could confirm it's, you know, a name, or it's like a shopping list or something like that. You know, something really boring. We'd be like, oh, okay. And then move on, and, you know, we wouldn't have this kind of drive to find out more. So I guess my answer is maybe I wouldn't want to do that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of At Home with the Picts, A Crafted Legacy, and if you did, please tell your friends, share it, help us get the word out. And maybe you have a theory about the Picts you'd like to share. Well, let us know, leave a comment. Special thanks to all our guests for sharing their time, skills and expertise with us. Thanks to Groam House Museum for letting us explore their collections. Huge thanks to Debbie R. Moore for the wonderful sound design, and of course, special thanks to the Heritage Lottery Fund for their support in making this series possible.